Hi guys, Josh here, aka Beards and Books. If you haven't guessed, today I'm doing a Game of Thrones special. Hope you enjoy. Put the books back, it's too much to hold. So everyone, if you've seen any of my videos, you'll have no doubt heard me talk about Game of Thrones. I think I mention them in pretty much every video. It is my favourite all-time series, aside from Harry Potter, but I'm not going to compare them because that's just wrong. It is the 22nd anniversary of the first ever Game of Thrones book on August the 1st. So it seems like a great excuse to talk about why I love this series and why you need to read it. So I'm going to break this video down, guys. I'm going to do just some quick pointers that I found out when reading up about Game of Thrones, some facts that I found really interesting. I'm going to do my plus points, which will be the bulk of the video, my negative points, which will be very small, and my suggestions for anyone that wants to read the series that hasn't been able to, either through fear of how big it is, as you just saw, or just not sure where to start. So firstly, as I mentioned, it is the 22nd anniversary of the first ever Game of Thrones book on August the 1st. So it came out on August the 1st, 1996. Now it seems crazy to me that the series started in 1996 and is still going on. George, what are you doing? But I will touch on that later. I'll get sidetracked if I do it now, so we'll touch on that later. To touch on the enormity of the series, so as you just saw, there are a lot of books. In terms of pages, there are 4,228 pages, and that's just the books that are out at the moment. We're still waiting for the last two books in the series to be released, so it will comfortably clear 5,000 pages by the time the series is done. In terms of chapters, there are currently 344, but again that will increase when the next two books comes out. And my favourite fact, so I'm not an audiobook fan, I just don't get into them as much, I can't concentrate. But if you wanted to listen to the whole series of Game of Thrones through audiobooks, it is 198 hours, 27 minutes. That is over 8 days solid, listening to it 24/7 for you to catch up to the series, which is just, that's a lot. Now I realise the size of the series, as I've just described, is what puts a lot of people off. So I'm going to go through my plus points now, why I think you definitely need to read it, especially if you're a fantasy fan. So I've written down a bunch of plus points and why I think you definitely need to read this series. I'm going to talk about them briefly, expand on them just so you know why these are such positives. The first one being the world building. George R. R. Martin has built an enormous world with Game of Thrones. The first thing you'll see when you open the book is a map of the world, especially where the book takes place, as each book kind of varies by where it's based. Each different country, realm, whatever part of the world, whatever you want to call it, has its own traits and its own quirky sort of how it's set up. The same as the world now. No two parts of the world are the same. The people are different, the way they speak are different, and the way that they live their life is completely different. Now this lends itself really well to the story because each of the main characters that we follow are from somewhere else. So their traits are different, how they view the world is different, and it works really well with the characters. Speaking of characters, Game of Thrones has some brilliant characters, whether it's on the TV screen or on the book. The main characters themselves, so we'll say the main characters are Jon Snow, Daenerys Targaryen and Tyrion. They are probably the main ones, also including Cersei, including Jaime. There's so many big characters. Their development from book one and page one compared to where I am now, which is nearly at the end of the available series, is just crazy. Obviously, given how many pages there are in the story, there's a lot of time to really develop the characters. None of the characters go straight from A to B. They all have their own hardships, they all have their own journeys, and most of them are completely different from the start of the series. But to me, that shows just how well written this is, and it shows how much George R. R. Martin really put a lot of thought into this. This series, like no other, at least in my opinion, really keeps you on your toes. No one is safe. So many of the characters that you fall in love with die a chapter later, and I know that is also a negative point for some people. Obviously, a lot of the main characters are in at the start and are in at the end, and other main characters come in as the story goes. But a lot of the side characters are not safe. Although this is a magical world and there's a lot of magic, dragons and such in Game of Thrones, if you die, you're pretty much dead. I'm not going to spoil anything because there are, changes to that rule, but you die, you're dead. One that I will touch on in a positive and a negative fact is this is a long series. Now for me, I love the world of Game of Thrones and I love the characters. So the fact that it's a long series just gives me more chance to be in that story with the characters. If you're not a Game of Thrones fan, then it being a long series will really put you off because you're not going to want to invest, 198 audiobook hours to listen to a series that you're not involved in. But if you're like me and you really enjoy it, the fact that it's long just gives you so much more time in that world. Next point I want to touch on is this is such a well-written book. Everything has history. Every big family, so obviously, you know, in terms of royal families and such, you all have their own history, they all have their own sigils, they all have everything that makes that family them. They all have their own dark secrets, they all have their pluses and their negatives. But the one thing that isn't touched on as much as it should be is the religions of Game of Thrones. Front door goes, are you mid-filming? So as I was saying, the religions in Game of Thrones are also really well fleshed out. So there are probably 3 or 4 main religions. So you have the Seven, which is the main religion in King's Landing. You have the Northern Gods, which classes the Old Gods, which are the main gods of the Northern Realms. You have Rahalor, who is the Lord of Light, he's called, which is one of the kind of Eastern gods. And then there's the Many-Faced God. I just ran up the stairs. And then there's the Many-Faced God, who is talked about more in the sort of Braavosi realms. Some of this will make no sense, but it's history. There's so much in the series. It's not just that guy hates that guy. It's just epic. Now, I, like a lot of people, really got into Game of Thrones through the TV series. I knew it was a book series before, but I'd never really thought to pick up and read them just because I hadn't heard too much about them. That would change when the TV series came out. I watched the first probably season or 2 and I absolutely fell in love with it. I know this isn't necessarily book related, but for any Game of Thrones fans, it's just an extra side on. The TV series is incredible. I think it's one of the most expensive TV shows ever made, if not the most expensive. But it's also a good place to start if you're not sure whether the series would be for you. Watch a couple of episodes of the TV series. They really do follow the books heavily, at least for the first couple of seasons. By the time you get to, I think it's A Feast for Crows in the book series, they do start to differentiate and go their own way. But I think that's just because the TV series has to make cuts in terms of what goes from the book into the show, just because otherwise they would be there forever. So there are certain aspects that are lost from the books into the TV show. But the TV show is amazing. It's absolutely brilliant. So if you haven't already, definitely check out the series and the books. Now this next one's going to be difficult for me because I'm going to talk about bad points. Now, as I said, I'm a massive Game of Thrones fan, so expect this to be quite short. What I'm going to do, I'm going to base the bad points on what I think other people's perceptions of the series are. So not necessarily my negative views, but what other people may view as negative, especially from the comments that I've had from people that want to read Game of Thrones. So the first point, and probably the point that gets brought up the most, is just the sheer size of the story. Now, as I said, for me, I love that. It probably helps that I only have 1 book left to read. Out of the available series, I've got Dance of Dragons Part 2, and then I'm officially caught up. So I'm at the end of that journey. Anyone that is just about to pick them up, as you saw by my thumbnail and my, the start of the video, it's a lot of books to read. I'm not going to lie to you guys. It takes time and it is a commitment. But the series, for any fantasy fans, you have to try Game of Thrones. If you're not a fantasy fan, I'm not going to lie, it's probably not for you. The world building, the characters, the different languages that are used, the magic system, everything that's in there is brilliant. But only if you're into that in the first place. If you're more of a thriller, a romance, even a horror kind of person, it might not necessarily be for you. But it's such an epic series in the same vein as something along the lines of Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. It's something that everyone should at least consider trying, in my opinion. As I touched on, I have 1 book left to read in the series, which is A Dance with Dragons Part 2. And I am waiting, the same as a lot of people, for George R. R. Martin to announce what's going to happen next in the series. Now, to put it into context, A Dance with Dragons Part 2 came out in 2011. That's 8 years. No, it's not. Math. That is 7 years ago. 7 years of waiting. I mean, I haven't been waiting, but the people that read A Dance with Dragons Part 2 and it first got, they've been waiting 7 years for this book. Who knows when we'll do it? There's a big rumour going around that people think George R. R. Martin has made a deal with HBO, who make the TV series, to release the book after the final series of the TV show comes out, which personally I think makes a lot of sense in terms of why that would be the case. I want the book, and I want the book tomorrow. But given that the TV series is on its last ever series, and the book and TV show are going in different directions at this point, I think it makes sense from the TV show, people's mind, that the book is released after. I expect George has had a good old payoff on that, because a lot of people, myself, I've been tweeting him, and I'm chasing it, and I ain't getting nowhere. So I do think there's something that is preventing the books coming out. Now, I know George R. R. Martin, it does take his time between books, but 7 years seems like quite a long time. Unless maybe he's planning on releasing both of the final books at the same time. I mean, again, that would make sense, but I don't think that's the case. I think he's most likely been paid off by HBO. Again, I might be wrong. This is just an assumption and a guess. But the series is not finished. That puts a lot of people off, because if we follow George's track record at the moment, the next book could come out next year, and in theory, you could have to wait another 7 years. That puts me off, and I'm nearly finished. Also, as I touched on, this is what I would class as an epic fantasy series. It is not for the faint of heart. If you are not a fantasy fan, it's heavy. It's heavy. The characters are completely different to anything in our world. The religion's different. Where it's based is different. The fact that there are dragons in it is completely different. The story is done so well that I do genuinely believe anyone that at least has an interest in fantasy can get into it. But if you're genuinely not a fantasy fan, it's not for you. It's not for you. Now, something I get asked a lot is my suggestions on how to read Game of Thrones. I've gone through the series relatively quick. I say relatively quick, it's probably taken me about a year, but I have by choice been spacing the books out, knowing full well that the last books aren't out yet. So what I tend to do, because the average Game of Thrones book is at least 500 pages, most of them are more like 600-700 pages, so they are heavy. What I tend to do is I will have my Game of Thrones book, which will be my main book, the book that I will read at work, and whenever I want to sit down and spend an hour with a book. But I tend to have a side book at the same time, usually something a lot simpler to read, a short 300-page YA book, something along the sciencey lines. I tend to avoid going fantasy again, because fantasy on fantasy, even if it is YA, can get heavy. But a suggestion from me to you, if you're interested in reading Game of Thrones, definitely give it a good read. But if there's a book on the side that you've wanted to read as well that is an easy read, definitely don't pick another big book or difficult book. But if there's something simple you can pick up alongside, definitely do it. Because in the days where you're feeling a bit heavy from Game of Thrones, because there is a lot going on and a lot to take in, especially if you don't know the story, a side book can really help because it just takes the pressure away. As I mentioned at the start, you have also got the audiobooks option. This is probably the one I recommend the least, purely from preference. I'm not big into audiobooks. I don't think it's the best way, especially for a series of this nature, to get into it, to get fully engrossed in it. Now, you could always try doing part book, part audiobook, read the book where you can, maybe listen to audiobook on the bus at work, whenever you do it, to help you get through the series. I mean, I don't think there's any issue with that whatsoever. It's just personal preference. I take the series in more when I've got the book in my hand. Another option, and one that I'm a big fan of, is graphic novels. So the Game of Thrones series has its own set of graphic novels. I believe there are 4 out at the moment. That is 5. There are 4 out at the moment. This isn't finished. I think it's similar to the books. They are still working on the series, but I'll show you some of the artwork. Hopefully it's nothing too gruesome. As you can see, the art style is done very well. Very colourful, very sort of productive and easy to read. Now, the negative points to doing the graphic novels, from where they're a lot shorter, as you can see, they obviously cherry pick from the books. Probably more in line with the TV series, I'd say, than the books. They can't fit everything in. Again, a 700-page graphic novel just makes no sense to anyone, including the artwork. It'll probably be even bigger. But they're a very good way of getting to know the story and then maybe progressing into the books. I'd also say the TV series is a very good way of getting to know the story, so it's easier to take in and digest before going on to the books. I'm about to wrap up, guys, so as I've mentioned, I'm a massive Game of Thrones fan. I probably go on about this in most videos, so I apologise in advance if you're getting slightly sick of it. I won't be able to much longer because I'll be waiting for the book like everyone else. So I wanted to do this video just to do a shout out. I've had a lot of questions on Game of Thrones, so I wanted to kind of include everything in one big video. I really hope you've enjoyed this, guys. Let me know down in the comments. Are you Game of Thrones fans? Are you caught up? Are you like me and you're still working your way through it? Or are you new to the series and thinking of trying it? Or just, hell no, it's too much. Let me know. I hope you've enjoyed, guys. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.